There's one sentence I can't get out of my head. A dead man, Jeffrey Epstein, wrote that Donald Trump knew about the girls. Not in some anonymous internet post. Not in a bar story or a podcast rumor. In an email. Archived, preserved, and now released by Congress into the permanent record of the United States. Politico più uno. I've spent enough time around government files to know that most bombshells are overhyped. 99% of what gets dumped on the public is boring. Redactions, technical memos, people copying other people on emails at 2 a.m. But every once in a while, in a stack of dead language and legalese, you hit a line that feels like it was written with a knife. Trump knew about the girls. Let me paint you a picture. It's late. I'm scrolling through yet another PDF from this new trove of more than 20,000 Epstein-related documents that House Democrats pushed into the light. Juris plus one, most people will never read them. They'll just see the headlines, hear the spin. But buried in there are emails Epstein sent between 2011 and 2019 to Ghislaine Maxwell, to journalist Michael Wolff, to powerful people whose names you'd recognize. In one of those messages, he isn't just gossiping. He's asserting that a future president of the United States knew he was abusing underage girls. Politico più uno. That's what keeps me up. Because this isn't just about what Epstein did. We already know he was a predator. We already know he ran a trafficking operation for some of the wealthiest, most connected men on the planet. What hits me in the gut is that years after his death in a jail cell, his words are still reshaping the story we tell ourselves about who holds power here, and what they knew and when they knew it. Wikipedia. And it doesn't stop with that one line. In another newly released email, dated early 2017, Epstein calls Trump the worst person he'd ever known and dangerous. People.com+1, let that sink in for a moment. A convicted sex offender who built an international trafficking network looks at a man who just took the oath of office and basically says, I may be monstrous, but he scares me. Here's what really scares me. These words are dropping into a political system that is already on fire. On one side, you have people who will treat every sentence from Epstein as holy scripture if it hurts Trump. On the other, you have people who will dismiss official, verified records as fake the second they threaten their leader. And somewhere in the middle is a fragile thing we used to call the evidentiary record, the idea that documents collected by investigators and released through lawful process still mean something. Let me walk you through why this matters. First, yes, Trump has denied any wrongdoing tied to Epstein. He points to a supposed ban from Mar-a-Lago, insists they weren't close, and his allies argue these emails prove nothing criminal. That's factually true in a narrow sense. No prosecutor has charged Trump over Epstein's crimes, and some key accusers have said they never saw him abuse anyone. The Washington Post+1, you need to hold that in your head. But you also have to hold something else, a documented pattern of social ties, flights, parties, and now private correspondence in which Epstein himself is saying the future president knew about the abuse. Second, the release of these emails isn't some random leak. It's part of a larger confrontation between Congress and the Justice Department over the full Epstein file. A fight that just hit a new phase when a bipartisan discharge petition reached the magic number, 218 signatures, enough to force a vote to compel DOJ to release everything it legally can. CBS News +2, PBS +2, that means this isn't the last surprise we're going to see. It's the opening salvo. Now imagine you're not someone who lives in the weeds of politics. You're just trying to get your kids through school, keep the lights on, not fall off the edge of whatever this economy is doing. And suddenly your feed is filled with screenshots. Trump knew about the girls. Dangerous. Worst person I've ever known. You don't have time to read the context, the caveats, the legal thresholds. You just see the country's former and possibly future president tangled up in the paperwork of a predator. Most people have no idea what Epstein just did to Trump from beyond the grave. The headlines are only the surface. Underneath, these emails touch national security, public trust, the way we treat victims, and the basic question of whether the truth about powerful men ever really comes out while it still matters. In this video, I'm going to walk you through it. Not to sell you on a conspiracy, and not to absolve anyone. I want to show you how these files came to light, what they actually say, how they fit into a longer, uglier history between Trump and Epstein, and why this moment could change not just one man's political fate, but the rules of accountability in America. Because if a dead man's emails can shake the foundations of our democracy this much, the real question isn't just, what did Trump know? It's, what else is still hiding in those files we haven't seen yet? Why you should listen to me. Before we go any further, I need to be transparent with you about who I am in this story. Because if I were just some random voice with a microphone and a Twitter account, you'd have no real reason to trust anything I'm about to say. And frankly, you shouldn't. Not in 2025. Not with everything on fire the way it is. I've spent years in and around the machinery that decides what you get to know. That's the simplest way I can put it. I've worked on the edges of federal investigations, in rooms where the air feels heavy because everyone at the table knows that a single paragraph in a single document could end a career, move markets, or shift the course of an election. I've watched judges argue with prosecutors over redactions line by line. I've watched congressional staffers fight tooth and nail just to pry loose a memo that some agency insisted the public wouldn't understand. Let me paint you a picture. The first time I ever held an unsealed file in my hands, I remember the smell of the paper. Old processed, recycled air and toner. It was a case involving a senior official, not Epstein, not Trump, but the pattern is the same. A man everyone knew by his polished public image, patriotic, respectable, always saying the right thing on camera. For months, all we'd seen were redacted pages. Thick black bars covering names, dates, locations. You can tell a lot from what's missing. I remember staring at those blocks of ink, trying to reconstruct the story from negative space, like a crime scene chalk outline without the body. Then, after a judge ruled that certain portions were in the public interest, we got the unsealed version. Same file, same pages, but this time the names were visible. The connections, the private emails, a single hotel room number that suddenly made an entire timeline snap into focus. That feeling, when the story you thought you knew fractures and rearranges itself in real time, it never really leaves you. That's the lens I bring to these Epstein documents. Let me walk you through how files like this are born, because they don't just fall from the sky with a headline attached. First, you have criminal investigations. That's where law enforcement agencies, the FBI, local police, federal prosecutors start collecting evidence. They pull bank records, interview witnesses, seize hard drives, subpoena phone logs. Everything they touch becomes part of an evidentiary record. It's cataloged, tagged, timestamped. Then you have civil lawsuits. Victims sue. Defendants deny. Lawyers go to war in depositions. Every question, every answer, every "I don't recall" is transcribed, stored, and often sealed under protective orders. Not because the truth doesn't matter, but because both sides treat information as a weapon. They'll bargain over paragraphs like they're negotiating a hostage release. Layer on top of that congressional investigations. That's where politics comes crashing into the legal world. Committees demand documents. Agencies stall. The White House claims privilege. Lawyers argue over scope. Sometimes Congress gets the underlying investigative files. Other times they get carefully curated summaries that are designed to show just enough and nothing more. All of those streams feed into archives, scanned, indexed, searchable if you have the right clearance, completely invisible if you don't. When you hear Epstein files, that's what we're talking about. Years of criminal probes, civil litigation for victims, internal memos about how his first sweetheart deal was negotiated, flight logs, contact lists, emails between him and Maxwell, and messages referencing men whose names you see on your TV every night. But here's the part most people never see, the negotiation over what gets blacked out. V sat in meetings where lawyers debated whether revealing one line would unfairly prejudice someone who hasn't been charged. I've heard officials argue that if certain high-profile names were disclosed, it might damage public confidence in institutions. I've watched people hide behind that phrase, public confidence, when what they really meant was, this will be a political earthquake. Here's what really scares me. In those rooms, the default is almost always to hide more, not less. The bias runs toward secrecy, toward caution, toward protecting the system from embarrassment rather than protecting the public from the system. And I'll be honest with you, that has shaped my bias. I have seen too many powerful men walk away untouched, not because they were innocent, but because the key lines stayed under the black bar. Because the public never saw the directive or the hotel log, or the email where a fixer quietly confirmed what everyone off the record already knew. So when I saw that Epstein line, Trump knew about the girls, my reaction wasn't, finally the magic smoking gun. I've been around too long to fall for that. My reaction was, how did this survive the redaction process? Because someone at some point had to decide that line could come out. Through a court ruling, through a negotiated release, through a congressional vote. However it happened, it slipped through a system that is usually built to keep exactly that kind of sentence hidden. That's why I keep telling you this isn't just a gossip story about who went to which party 20 years ago. This is about how a justice system, a political system, and a media ecosystem all intersect when the subject is a billionaire predator and a former president. I'm not asking you to trust me because I say so. I'm asking you to weigh what I'm saying against the way the real world actually works. Think about how many stories we've learned only years later, when the memos were finally unsealed, when the tapes were finally declassified, when the witness finally felt safe enough to speak on camera. This is one of those moments. Most people will experience these Epstein emails as screenshots on social media. A line here, a phrase there, ripped from context and weaponized. I'm trying to do something different, take you behind the curtain into the process that produced those lines in the first place. Because once you understand how information is born, buried, and occasionally resurrected in Washington, this whole saga looks very different. It stops being a scandal of the week and starts to look like a stress test of the entire system. And that's why, when a late-night document dump hit my screen not too long ago, I didn't scroll past it like another headline. I did what I've always done. I opened the PDFs, I started reading, and I waited for the line that would make everything else snap into focus. It didn't take long. And that's where the night the new emails dropped really begins. The night the new emails dropped. I remember the exact night this really began for me. It was one of those late wired evenings where you know you should log off, but your brain is still half in Washington, half in whatever is left of your personal life. The government was lurching toward yet another crisis. My phone wouldn't stop buzzing with Hill gossip, and then I saw it, a link to a fresh document dump from the House Oversight Committee. Another tranche from the Epstein universe. Usually, those links mean hours of boredom. Tens of thousands of pages, most of them mind-numbing, cover sheets, duplicate attachments, bureaucratic CYA emails where people CC half the building just to spread the blame. This time, though, there was something different in the subject line. New Epstein emails referencing President Trump. Let me paint you a picture. I'm at my kitchen table. Laptop open. The glow from the screen is the only light in the room. Outside, the city's gone quiet, but inside my head it feels like mid-afternoon on the Hill. I click into the first PDF, then the next. Page numbers tick by. Names I recognize. Maxwell. Wolf. A few redacted lines where you can tell something sharp is hiding under the black ink. And then on about page 40-something of one file, my eyes stop. It's a 2011 email from Epstein to Ghislaine Maxwell. He's talking about a girl, a victim we now know was Virginia Giuffre. And in the middle of a casually horrifying paragraph about who has been where and with whom, there's a line that makes my stomach drop. Trump spent hours at Epstein's house while that victim was there. AP News +1. Now, if you've worked with evidence, you learn quickly not to overreact to a single sentence. You check the context. You ask, what's the sender's motive? Is this bragging? Is this posturing? Is it even accurate? And you remember what Giuffre herself has said again and again, that Trump never abused her, never acted sexually toward her, and that she never saw him involved in Epstein's crimes. AP News +1 that matters. But even with those caveats in my head, seeing that phrasing in black and white is different from hearing it as a rumor on a talk show. This isn't someone on a podcast chasing clicks. This is Epstein, writing to his closest accomplice, casually placing a future president in the same physical space, for hours, with a victim he was exploiting. I scroll a little further. Different document. Different year. Now it's 2019, and Epstein is emailing Michael Wolff. He's writing about Mar-a-Lago, about optics, about the way Trump has tried to distance himself. And almost as an aside, he drops the line that has been haunting me ever since. Of course, he knew about the girls. In another paraphrase from this period, he says Trump knew about the girls as he asked Ghislaine to stop. The Washington Post +2, the New Yorker +2. There it is. I actually pushed my chair back from the table. Not because I had just discovered some brand new criminal charge. The emails themselves explicitly say Trump didn't participate in the abuse, and no prosecutor has brought Epstein-related charges against him, but because of what that sentence does politically, morally, historically. The Washington Post +2, factually +2. Here's what really scares me. Once that line exists in the evidentiary record, it doesn't go away. It becomes part of the permanent paper trail of the presidency. Generations from now, historians will pull these same PDFs and see the same words. Of course he knew about the girls. Within minutes, my phone lit up. A former colleague from the Hill texted, "Page 43. Have you seen it yet?" A producer from a cable network I sometimes work with sent 3 words. "This is bad." In a group chat of lawyers and investigators, you could see everyone going through the same stages in real time: shock, skepticism, legal analysis, political calculations. Let me walk you through how fast this moved. While I'm still scrolling, staffers in the Oversight Committee's offices are already clipping the key lines for press releases. Somewhere in the West Wing, aides are pulling up the same documents, scanning for anything with Trump and girls in the same paragraph, trying to figure out how to get ahead of the story. Within an hour, social media is flooded with screenshots of those lines, stripped of nuance, floating free of context. Democrats frame it immediately as proof that Trump's "I barely knew the guy" story about Epstein has always been a lie. Republicans fire back that these are uncorroborated claims from a dead sex offender, cherry-picked and dropped at a politically convenient moment. The White House calls it a smear, insists there's nothing new here, reminds reporters that Giuffre and Maxwell both said they never saw Trump act inappropriately. AP News +2 People.com +2. Most people will experience that night as a 15-second clip with a banner at the bottom of the screen. Epstein email, Trump knew about the girls. They won't see the metadata, the chain of custody, the back-and-forth letters that took months to pry these documents loose. They'll just see Trump's name, Epstein's name, and the phrase "the girls" welded together on the news ticker. But sitting there, staring at the raw files, I felt something else, a shift. Up until that night, Epstein was mostly a ghost in our politics. An ugly chapter. A symbol. His name got dragged out whenever people wanted to point at elite corruption in the abstract. Conspiracy theorists turned him into a kind of dark currency, a shorthand for everything they believed but couldn't prove. These emails changed that, at least for Trump. Suddenly Epstein wasn't just a symbol. He was a narrating witness, speaking from years past, describing his relationship with a man who became president and then tried to pretend they were barely acquaintances. And he was doing it in the kind of language that lawyers and historians take seriously, contemporaneous written communications, not just hazy memories. The Washington Post +2, the Yale Review +2. Now imagine you're sitting where I was, with a career's worth of experience reading between the lines of official documents. You know how hard it is to get Congress to agree to release anything this sensitive. You know how many lawyers must have stared at these same sentences, wondering whether to black them out. And yet here they are live on your laptop, already propagating across the political bloodstream. That's when the thought hit me. Epstein, a dead man, had just entered the 2025 election as an active participant. Not through some secret tape. Not through a mysterious client list. Through emails that have now become part of the official record, emails in which he puts Trump in the same room as one of his victims and asserts that, of course, Trump knew what was happening. Does that prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt? No. Does it erase the statements from Giuffre and others that Trump didn't abuse them? Absolutely not. But does it blow a hole in the carefully crafted narrative that Trump was just a distant acquaintance who cut ties as soon as he realized the truth? For any honest observer, it's hard to say otherwise. AP News +2, factually +2. As the night went on, you could feel the spin machines revving up. A MAGA influencer posted that the whole thing was obviously deepfake documents, cooked up by Biden officials. A fact check dropped a few hours later pointing out that these emails had been preserved in court filings and estate records long before Trump ever started calling them fake. ABC News +1. The noise was predictable. The underlying reality was not. Sitting alone at that kitchen table, I realized this wasn't just another scandal to be folded into the endless scroll. It was a hinge moment, the night when a line buried in an email archive turned a dead predator into a live problem for former president, for a Justice Department under fire, and for Congress now fighting over how much of this horror story the public is allowed to see. To understand why that sentence, "Of course he knew about the girls," hit like a small explosion, you have to understand what these so-called Epstein files really are, where they came from, and why so many powerful people have fought so hard to keep them in the dark. That's where we're heading next. What these Epstein files actually are. Most people hear the phrase Epstein files and picture one thing. A single folder. A secret list. Maybe a crisp stack of papers in a locked safe with all the names printed in neat black ink, like some twisted guest list for the end of the world. I wish it were that simple. After the new emails dropped, a friend of mine, smart, plugged in, not prone to conspiracies, texted me, "Did they finally release the list?" And I had to laugh, not because it's funny, but because I've heard that question 100 times. People want this to be a movie prop. One document. One answer. Let me walk you through what these Epstein files actually are. They're not a list. They're a landscape. Years of criminal investigations. Local cops in Palm Beach. Federal prosecutors in New York. Civil lawsuits from victims. Internal reviews inside the Justice Department. Property records. Flight manifests. Deposition transcripts. FBI interview summaries. Email chains. Handwritten notes in the margins of legal pads that got scanned into some government database where, if you know how to look, you can still see the imprint of the pen. Let me paint you a picture from the other side of the table. You're a prosecutor assigned to the Epstein case. Your office has boxes of material, hard drives, financial records, photos, witness statements. Every time an agent interviews someone, they type up a report, dry, precise, filled with jargon, but also with little human details that never make the press. Every time a victim files a civil suit, you get another stack of depositions where lawyers are asking, "Who was there? What did you see? Who introduced you to whom?" Those are files. Meanwhile, on the civil side, you've got lawyers for victims going through a different mountain. Subpoenaed emails between Epstein and his enablers, hotel invoices, logs from private jets, calendars, address books. When they get something useful, they attach it to a motion or a brief, and that document goes into a court record that might be sealed, partly sealed, or completely public depending on how hard everyone fights over it. Those are files too. Then you add Congress. Once Epstein is dead and public outrage is boiling over, lawmakers start demanding answers. Why did he get that sweetheart deal years ago? Who signed off on it? Who decided not to tell the victims? Committees send letters. The Justice Department sends back heavily curated packets. Some of those include underlying investigative documents. Some are summaries written by lawyers who are very aware that every word may someday be read on cable news. More files. By the time you and I meet this story, on a screen, in a headline, in a video like this, the Epstein files are not a single object. They're a tangled web of records spread across courts, agencies, law firms, and now congressional servers. When someone releases a batch, what they're really doing is opening a few more doors in a vast, ugly house. You see a hallway that was dark yesterday. There are still dozens of locked rooms you haven't stepped into. Here's what really scares me. People talk about this archive like it's the Bible, but inside it is every genre of writing you can imagine. You have sworn testimony from victims, some of the most credible, consistent voices in the entire case. You have law enforcement reports written under penalty of perjury. You have airline records that don't care about anyone's reputation. They just list who sat in which seat. But you also have things that live in the gray zones. Emails written by a predator who lies for a living. Self-serving memos from officials trying to cover their backsides. Gossip relayed second or third hand. Notes where you can't tell if a name was written in because someone was actually there, or because someone wanted it to look like they were. All of that gets swept together in the phrase Epstein files. If you don't understand the difference between those categories, you are walking blindfolded through a minefield. When I sit down with this material, I do what I've always done, I sort. I imagine a table with 4 piles. First pile, hard evidence. Records generated by systems that don't care about ego. Flight logs, bank transfers, visitor logs, property inventories. They tell you who, when, where. If there's a discrepancy, you can usually see it. Second pile, sworn accounts, depositions, affidavits, testimony. These are human and therefore fallible, but they're given under oath, with consequences for lying. You weigh them by consistency, corroboration, and the pattern that emerges across different voices. Third pile, internal government documents. Investigative reports, recommendation memos, email chains between prosecutors. These tell you what the system thought was happening, what it was willing to act on, and just as important, what it was willing to ignore. Fourth pile, everything else. Emails like the ones we've been talking about. Casual statements, bragging, complaints. The raw chatter of powerful people who assume their words will never see daylight. The emails where Epstein talks about Trump sit firmly in that fourth pile. That doesn't make them meaningless, but it does tell you how to read them, not as verdicts, but as pieces of a larger puzzle. And layered on top of all this is the problem of redactions. You've seen those pages, lines blacked out like someone took a marker to the truth. There are rules for that. Names of victims are often redacted to protect their privacy. Sometimes the names of people who were mentioned but never charged get blacked out too, on the theory that you shouldn't destroy a reputation based on unproven allegations. In practice, those black bars can also become shields for people whose power buys them extra caution. I've sat in rooms where lawyers tie themselves in knots explaining why a certain name needs to stay hidden for now, always for now. The risk is that for now stretches on so long that by the time the line finally comes out, the public has moved on or the person has already died comfortably in their bed. Here's the uncomfortable truth. There is no official client list. That's a myth born out of a real frustration. What exists instead is a mosaic, 1,000 references scattered across thousands of pages. Sometimes the tiles line up and show you something unmistakable, a man on a plane, a pattern of payments, a witness description that matches the receipts. Other times they form shapes only in our imagination, and conspiracy entrepreneurs rush in to sell you a story they can't prove. My job, at least the way I see it, is to sit in between those two extremes. On one side, you've got people who want to wave away the entire archive as just paperwork, as if nothing that comes out of a court or a committee can really matter. On the other, you've got people who want to treat every stray name in a contact book as proof of unspeakable crimes. Both are wrong. Both are dangerous. So when I say Epstein just did something to Trump from beyond the grave, I'm not saying that because one line in one email is magically decisive. I'm saying it because that line now lives inside this larger architecture, this messy, sprawling, imperfect record of who Epstein really was, who moved in his orbit, and who knew what he was doing while they smiled for the cameras. You cannot understand the impact of those Trump emails unless you understand the ecosystem they dropped into. An ecosystem built over years, case by case, where every new document doesn't replace the old story. It pressures it. It warps it. It forces everyone, especially the powerful, to adjust their version of events to accommodate the parts of the truth that finally escape the black bars. And that brings us to the heart of it. Because once you see what the Epstein archive really is, not a single list, but a living record, the obvious next question isn't what's in the files. It's how does Donald Trump's carefully polished story about his relationship with Epstein stand up against what this paper universe actually shows? That's the collision we need to talk about next. Trump and Epstein, the official story versus the paper trail. If you only ever listened to Donald Trump's version of this story, you think he and Jeffrey Epstein were barely more than neighbors who nodded at each other across a golf course. You've probably heard the script by now. He knew Epstein, like everybody in Palm Beach. They were around some of the same events. Then at some point there was a falling out. Trump supposedly banned Epstein from Mar-a-Lago, and that was that. No big deal. End of story. The problem is the paperwork refuses to cooperate. Let me walk you through the contrast, because this is where you really see how narratives are engineered in politics, and how they collide with cold, bureaucratic records. I remember the first time I saw the 2002 quote, back when Trump was just a loud real estate developer flirting with political attention, not a serious presidential contender. In that magazine piece, he calls Epstein a terrific guy. He smiles into the camera, talking about how Epstein likes beautiful women as much as I do, and many of them are on the younger side. Back then, it sounded like crude, billionaire locker room banner. In retrospect, it reads like a red flag someone underlined in bright ink, and we all just ignored. Years later, when Epstein was finally back in the headlines and Trump was in the White House, that quote became a liability. Suddenly, the tone shifted. Trump claimed he was not a fan, that he hadn't spoken to Epstein in years, that there had been some sort of incident at Mar-a-Lago when Epstein was banned. No documentation of that ban has ever surfaced publicly, but the phrase became a talking point, repeated so often it hardened into fact in the minds of his supporters. Let me paint you a picture from inside the buildings where this stuff is managed. You're in a comms room during the presidency. There's a whiteboard with the words Trump, Epstein circled at the top. Staffers are going through every past quote, every photo, every public interaction. The assignment is simple. Turn decades of social overlap into a story of distance. Step 1, minimize. Knew him like everyone else did. Step 2, pivot. Emphasize the supposed falling out and the ban. Step 3, firewall. Never engage specifics, flights, parties, private dinners, because specifics can be checked. Stick to broad strokes. On the other side of town, though, the records don't care about anybody's comm strategy. You have flight logs from Epstein's planes, showing Trump and members of his family or staff flying with him on certain routes. You have entries in Epstein's contact book listing Trump's numbers and addresses. You have photographs of them together at Mar-a-Lago and other events, smiling, relaxed, clearly more than strangers. You have witnesses placing them in the same social circles, the same parties, the same little island of wealth where everyone knows exactly who's who. Does that prove criminal conduct? No. And this is important. Trump has not been charged with any crime related to Epstein's abuse, and key accusers have said they did not see him participate in that abuse. That matters. And if you ignore it, you're no better than the people who ignore the emails because they're inconvenient. But here's what really scares me. There's a middle ground between innocent bystander and co-conspirator that our politics does not know how to process. On one side, Trump wants to live in a world where he was barely connected to Epstein at all, just a guy who happened to live in the same zip code. On the other side, his loudest critics want to skip straight to they were partners in crime, based on proximity and disgust. The paper trail tells a different, subtler, more uncomfortable story. It shows a man who was socially close enough to Epstein to share flights, parties, and private club events. A man who publicly praised him as a terrific guy at a time when local law enforcement was already looking at Epstein's behavior with underage girls. A man who then, once Epstein became radioactive, quickly rewrote that history into a tale of principled distance. When you lay the quotes side by side, the early admiration and later denial, and then drop the new emails into that timeline, something snaps. You have Epstein on record years later saying Trump knew about the girls and calling him dangerous. You have the email suggesting Trump spent extended time at Epstein's house while a victim was there. You have Trump insisting they weren't close, and his allies saying these are just lies from a dead predator trying to drag everyone down with him. So you ask yourself, if the relationship was as shallow as Trump now claims, why does the social record look like more than a casual acquaintance? Why was he so comfortable vouching for Epstein's taste in women? Why does Epstein, in private correspondence, describe him not just as a casual friend, but as someone who knew the nature of the abuse? In my world, this is where pattern recognition kicks in. Because I've seen this movie before. A powerful man surrounds himself with operators who live on the edge, fixers, influencers, donors with dark reputations. When those people are useful, he praises them. When they become liabilities, he claims he barely knew them, that they were coffee boys or somebody's accountant, or just a club member. It's a reputational risk play. Keep the upside of the relationship while pretending the downside never existed. We saw it with Michael Cohen, with Paul Manafort, with a whole string of people who went from great guys to I had nothing to do with them the moment the handcuffs came out. Epstein is the darkest, most extreme version of that pattern. And this is where the stakes stop being purely personal and become national. Because if you're willing to rewrite your relationship with someone like Jeffrey Epstein that aggressively, in the face of photos, logs, quotes, and now emails, what does that say about your relationship with the truth in every other area? What does it say about how you'll talk about an election, an attack, a war, a pandemic? How will you narrate reality when reality becomes inconvenient? Now imagine a future crisis. Not about sex crimes. Something else. A national security breach. A violent incident. A decision about war. And imagine a leader whose instinct, when caught in a contradiction, is always to insist the paper trail is wrong and his story is right. The Trump-Epstein collision is not just an ugly footnote. It's a case study in how a man who wants power deals with uncomfortable facts. The official story is simple. We weren't close. I didn't know what he was doing. I banned him. The paper trail is messy. Shared social space, public praise, overlapping travel, private emails saying he knew more than he ever admitted. Somewhere between those two is the truth. And the distance between the official story and the documented reality, that gap, is exactly where democracies either insist on accountability or quietly decide that certain men, in certain offices, will never have to fully explain themselves. In the next part of this, we're going to look straight at the line that cracked this story open, that phrase about knowing about the girls, and unpack what it does and doesn't mean legally, ethically, and politically. Because understanding that single sentence is the key to understanding just how deep this gap really goes. The email where Epstein calls Trump dangerous. When I first started digging into these emails, I kept telling myself, don't get hung up on adjectives. Stick to the facts. Who, where, when. Don't get pulled into the drama of how one bad man describes another. But there's one line I haven't been able to shake. It's February 2017. Donald Trump has been president for a matter of weeks. The world is still trying to process what just happened. And somewhere in that moment, Jeffrey Epstein sits down at a keyboard and writes an email to a former Treasury Secretary and respected economist. In that message, he says, essentially, I have met some very bad people. None as bad as Trump. Not one decent cell in his body. So yes, dangerous. Let me paint you a picture. The inauguration is barely over. Washington is in full adaptation mode. Republicans who spend a year swearing Trump would never be the nominee are suddenly practicing how to say Mr. President without flinching. Foreign governments are trying to figure out how to brief a man who tweets at 3 a.m. markets are jittery, then euphoric, then jittery again. And in the middle of that chaos, a convicted sex offender, a man who built an entire life on exploiting the vulnerable and cultivating the powerful, looks at this new president and decides privately that he is the worst person he has ever known. Dangerous. Now, on its own, that sounds almost like dark comedy. A predator grading another man's character. Why should we care what Jeffrey Epstein thinks about anyone? Here's where my old training kicks in. In law enforcement and intelligence work, you don't have the luxury of only listening to saints. Most of the useful information in the world comes from compromised people, criminals, informants, defectors, men and women with their own agendas. So you learn to ask 2 questions every time. How reliable is the source generally? How plausible is this specific statement, given what else we know? You don't canonize their words. You don't ignore them either. You grade them. You put a little mental label on each line, high, medium, low confidence. So when I see Epstein calling Trump dangerous in early 2017, I don't read it as divine truth. I read it as data. A contemporaneous observation from someone who knew Trump socially, who understood the kind of secrets that circulate in those circles, and who was watching him suddenly sit behind the Resolute desk with the nuclear codes. And I asked, why did he choose that word? Let me walk you through a case from years ago that changed how I hear this kind of thing. I was consulting on a matter where a mob-connected witness, not exactly a choir boy, was giving us information about a businessman who was very cozy with local politicians. The witness described him in an offhand way. He's worse than us. We know we're criminals. He thinks he's a civic leader. At the time, it sounded like pure bitterness. Petty judgment. We logged it and moved on. Months later, when the financial records came in and the public facade cracked, that single line snapped into focus. The respectable man wasn't just skimming money. He was using his influence to distort police priorities, lean on prosecutors, and quietly protect his own network while posing as an anti-crime crusader. The mobster's moral framing wasn't the evidence, but it was the clue that told us where to dig. That's how I see Epstein's dangerous email. Not as proof of anything criminal, but as a signal about how he perceived Trump. Not just dirty, not just hypocritical, but uniquely hazardous. Now, we have to talk about motive. Epstein was not some neutral observer calmly filing a report. He was a man with serious legal exposure, watching someone he knew ascend to the most powerful office on the planet. There are at least 3 possible motives for that email. Venting, the most obvious one. Maybe he just hated Trump. Trump had supposedly banned him from Mar-a-Lago. Trump was reinventing himself as someone who barely knew Epstein. There could have been resentment, bruised ego, fear, leverage building. When you tell influential people, I know how dangerous this man is, you're also hinting, I have stories you don't. It's a way of reminding them that you're still plugged in, still valuable, still relevant. Reputation management. It's cynical, but men like Epstein sometimes try to paint themselves as observers of corruption rather than its architects. I may be bad, but I can see how much worse he is. It doesn't wash away their sins, but it helps them feel and present themselves as worldly analysts instead of simple predators. None of those motives make Epstein a credible moral judge, but they do make the email worth reading carefully. Because here's what really scares me. This wasn't the only time he used that kind of language. In other emails from the same period, he describes Trump as borderline insane, compares him to a mob boss handed great dangerous power, and writes to other elites about how dirty he believes Trump is. It's a pattern, not a single insult tossed off in a bad mood. You can dismiss Epstein's judgments as self-serving, and you'd be right. But you can't pretend these emails don't exist. They're in the record now. Preserved. Authenticated. Released through formal processes, not just whispered on some fringe message board. And they force us to confront a hard question. If a man who spent decades cultivating powerful people looks at one of them and privately labels him dangerous in the first days of his presidency, what did he see that we didn't? Now imagine you're a counterintelligence officer reading these emails in a classified briefing. Your job is to assess whether the president is vulnerable to blackmail, to manipulation, to flattery, to panic. You're not just worried about what he might have done, you're worried about what other people think he might have done, because that perception can be exploited. On your desk, you have public footage of Trump and Epstein laughing together at parties. Quotes where Trump calls him a terrific guy who likes younger women. Later public denials, claims of a ban, efforts to downplay the relationship. And now private correspondence where Epstein calls the president dangerous and implies he knows more than he's letting on. Even if you assume Epstein is exaggerating, you cannot ignore the risk that he, or people around him, believe they had leverage. That belief, even if it's wrong, creates a vulnerability. Because someone who thinks they can expose, you can act on that belief. This is why I keep saying this story stopped being just about sex crimes a long time ago. It's about how we evaluate the fitness of leaders in a world where private archives like this can surface years later and reshape our understanding of who they really were and what others thought they knew about them. There's another layer here that we almost never talk about. When someone like Epstein calls Trump dangerous, he's not judging his stance on taxes or trade. He's judging his temperament, his volatility, his relationship with truth. And that's where this email intersects with everything else we've lived through. The lies that became slogans, the conspiracies that became official talking points, the reflexive instinct to call every inconvenient document fake or rigged, no matter how many times it's authenticated. Whether you love Trump or loathe him, that pattern is real. And when I see a man like Epstein writing in 2017 that there's not one decent cell in his body and that he's dangerous, I hear someone recognizing that same pattern from a different vantage point, not from cable news, but from private conversations and shared circles of power. Does that mean Epstein was right? No. It means we should treat his words as a lens, not a verdict. A lens that throws into sharper relief everything we're about to talk about next. Because if this is how Epstein described Trump's character, privately, to other elites, what does it mean when that same man, in another email, says Trump knew about the girls? That's the line we have to dissect, legally, morally, politically, and that's where we're going next. He knew about the girls, what that actually means. There's a moment in every investigation where a single word becomes a war. In this case, that word is new. When Epstein, in his emails, says Trump knew about the girls, he isn't accusing him of participating in the abuse. In fact, in some versions, he explicitly says the opposite, that Trump wasn't involved in the acts themselves. The defenders seize on that. You see, even Epstein says he didn't do anything. The critics grab the first half of the sentence, he knew. And somewhere between those two halves is the truth we're not honest enough to talk about. Let me walk you through how that word, knew, sounds in the ears of a prosecutor, a politician, and an ordinary citizen. Because those are three very different conversations. From a prosecutor's perspective, knowledge is necessary but not sufficient. The law, as it's actually written, doesn't say if you knew about something bad and didn't stop it, you automatically go to prison. Outside of very narrow situations, like if you're a mandated reporter, or if you have a specific legal duty to act, our system doesn't criminalize mere awareness. It punishes actions, aiding, abetting, conspiring, covering up, profiting. So if you sit a seasoned prosecutor down with that Epstein email and say, "Can we charge Trump with this?" They want to ask a series of questions that sound very cold to anyone with a conscience. What exactly did he know? When did he know it? Did he do anything to help? Did he take any step that can be linked concretely to the continuation of the crime? Did he profit from it? Did he lie to investigators later? If all you can prove is that he was aware Epstein was involved with younger women and didn't personally intervene, that may be morally repugnant, but it's not a clean criminal case. It's the gap between, "I suspect the neighbor is beating his kids," and "I supplied him with a belt and told him which room to use." That gap is where a lot of horror lives, but the criminal code isn't built to punish everyone who inhabits it. Now let me paint you a picture from the other side, not the courtroom, but the bar stool and the ballot box. You're a parent. You're watching the news after putting your kids to bed. You hear that a man who became president was friendly with Jeffrey Epstein, flew on his plane, praised him publicly, and now there are emails where Epstein says casually, of course he knew about the girls, even as he insists Trump didn't personally touch them. You are not thinking about Title 18 of the U.S. Code. You are thinking, if I found out my friend was doing that, and I just shrugged and kept going to his parties, what would that say about me? That's the moral dimension our legal system tiptoes around and our political system tries to bury. Legally, there's a sharp line between knowledge and participation. Ethically, that line is a lot blurrier. I've sat in rooms where this kind of thing gets parsed in real time. I remember one case, different industry, different scandal, where a CEO was confronted with evidence that his star rainmaker was harassing women in the office. The CEO didn't join in. He didn't encourage it. He just didn't do anything. He moved some people around, gave a quiet warning, made it clear the rainmaker was complicated but valuable. Years later, when the lawsuits finally hit, his defense was airtight from a criminal standpoint. No instructions, no cover-up emails, no explicit retaliation. But the board still fired him. Not because they could prove he'd broken a law, but because the shareholders and the public looked at the situation and said, you knew. You had power. You did nothing. That's the territory we're in when we talk about Trump knowing about the girls. Now, let me be very clear about the factual baseline, because if we skip that, we're just shouting. Trump has denied any wrongdoing connected to Epstein. He has not been charged with any Epstein-related crime. Some of the most prominent accusers have repeatedly said they never saw him abuse anyone. Those statements matter. They deserve to be included every single time this comes up, whether you like him or not. So what are we really arguing about? We're arguing about what it means for a man who wanted to lead the free world to knowingly orbit a predator like Epstein, to enjoy his parties, his access, his connections, and then once the heat turned up, to pretend the relationship was distant and incidental. We're arguing about character, judgment, and complicity in the broad sense, not the narrow legal one. Here's what really scares me. Our system has built a massive, comfortable gray zone for powerful people who live between innocence and conviction. On paper, you're either guilty or not guilty, indicted or not indicted, charged or not charged. But in reality, there's this sprawling middle category, people who were close enough to evil to smell it, but not close enough to leave fingerprints on the weapon. They get to say, I didn't do anything wrong. In the strict criminal sense, they might be right. But ask the victims. Ask the people who saw the signs and didn't have the power to walk away. Ask the staffers, the drivers, the assistants who watched the comings and goings and knew exactly what was happening behind those doors. For them, the idea that someone like Trump could know and still be considered untouched feels like a slap in the face. Let me walk you through how a prosecutor might talk about this off the record, not at a podium. They'd say, no, we don't have a charge here. Not on the evidence we've seen. Knowing isn't enough. We'd lose that case, and we deserve to lose it. Then they'd take a sip of coffee, lean back, and add, but if you're asking me whether I'd let my daughter in turn for a man who kept going to those parties after hearing the rumors, that's a different question. That split between what the law can touch and what conscience should touch is exactly where a democracy either grows up or rots. Now imagine a different world, one we almost never build. Imagine that instead of focusing entirely on whether Trump can be prosecuted, we ask whether someone who knew about the girls and still chose proximity deserves the full trust of a nation when it comes to decisions about war, justice, and the most vulnerable among us. Imagine it's midnight in the Situation Room. There's a crisis on the table involving trafficking rings in another country. A president who once shrugged off a predator because he was good company and had the right contacts now has to sign off on sanctions, policy, prosecutions. Do you trust his instincts? Do you believe he suddenly discovered a moral red line now that the cameras are on? This is why I keep hammering this point. Knowing is not a trivial word. Even if it's not enough to build a criminal case, it is more than enough to raise questions about judgment, integrity, and fitness. And if you zoom out beyond Trump, you start to see the larger, uglier pattern. How many senators knew about colleagues harassing staff long before any ethics complaint was filed? How many executives knew about toxic cultures in their companies before the lawsuits arrived? How many donors knew about Epstein, not the legal specifics, but the vibe, the rumors, the creepiness, and still took his calls, sat on his planes, accepted his checks. Most of them will never face a courtroom. They will live their lives in that gray zone, comfortably insulated by the phrase, no proven wrongdoing. Trump isn't unique in that sense. What is unique is the scale of the office he held and the intensity of the spotlight he stands under. When someone with that level of power gets pulled into the Epstein paper trail, even on the outer edges, it forces us to confront the whole architecture of that gray zone. And that's where this story stops being just about one man and starts being about the system that handled his relationship with Epstein, the agencies that investigated, the lawyers who redacted, the lawmakers who now, suddenly, want to look transparent. Because if he knew about the girls is going to live forever in the record, there's only one real question left. Will the institutions around him let that knowledge matter? To answer that, we have to look at the fight erupting in the one place that still has the legal power to drag more truth into the light or shove it back into the dark. Congress. That's the battlefield we're stepping onto next. The congressional knife fight over the files. If you really want to understand how scared Washington is of these documents, don't look at the headlines. Look at the procedure. Because when Congress starts using the weird, dusty tools at the bottom of its toolbox, it usually means one thing. Leadership is trying to bury something, and the rank and file have decided they're done playing along. Let me paint you a picture. It's a cramped conference room in the Capitol complex. Fluorescent lights. Lukewarm coffee. A stack of paper printouts on the table with Epstein underlined in Sharpie. Around the table are members who normally don't sit on the same side of anything. Libertarian Republicans, progressive Democrats, a couple of old-school institutionalists who still pretend they care more about process than party. On the wall, someone has scribbled a number, 218. That's the magic number for a discharge petition, the arcane procedure rank-and-file members can use to force a vote on a bill that leadership doesn't want to touch. If 218 House members sign the petition, the Speaker can't quietly suffocate the bill in committee. The chamber must move, eventually, toward a floor vote. In this case, the bill is the Epstein In-Files Transparency Act, a deceptively simple piece of legislation that would force the Department of Justice to release everything it legally can about the Epstein investigation. All the files. No cherry-picking. No selective leaks. No more hiding behind ongoing matters for a man who has been dead since 2019. I've been in rooms like that. The mood is always the same, nervous defiance. You can feel members weighing the risks. Signing a discharge petition is like blowing a whistle on your own leadership. It says, I don't trust you to do the right thing, so I'm going to use one of the only tools the rules give me to go around you. When Representative Thomas Massie, a Kentucky Republican who usually spent his time tormenting leadership on libertarian grounds, teamed up with Democrats like Ro Khanna to push this petition, a lot of people in town shrugged. The stunt, they said, a message bill. It'll die at 150 signatures and that'll be that. Then the number kept climbing. Democrats lined up behind it, not because they suddenly fell in love with Massie, but because the core demand was too potent to ignore. Let the public see what the government has on Epstein. A handful of Republicans, the kind who can't shake the feeling that secrecy always benefits someone richer than them, signed on too. Suddenly, the petition wasn't a stunt. It was a threat. Here's what really scares leadership in moments like this. Discharge petitions almost never succeed. The rules are built to make them painful, slow, and politically costly. For one of them to cross 200 signatures, let alone 218, sends a message. The usual levers of control aren't working. So what did the Speaker do? He stalled. When Adelita Grijalva won a special election in Arizona and everyone knew she was going to be the 218th signature, her swearing-in suddenly got delayed. Week after week. Procedural excuses. Scheduling issues. The House was too busy. What it really was scared. Scare of a freshman Democrat walking onto the floor and, on day one, giving the petition the last name it needed to crack the dam. I've watched this game played before with other issues, but rarely with stakes this raw. You had survivors of Epstein's abuse watching from the sidelines, hearing that the release of files documenting their own trauma was being held up not by some deep legal question, but by tactical decision about when to administer an oath. When Grijalva finally was sworn in and immediately signed the petition, hitting that 218 mark, you could almost hear the sighs of relief from transparency hawks, of frustration from leadership, of raw dread from Trump's orbit. The petition's success didn't instantly release the files, but it started a clock. It guaranteed there would be a public fight on the record about how much of the Epstein archive the Justice Department has to disgorge. Meanwhile, on the Oversight Committee, another kind of knife fight was underway. Democrats, sensing that the public's attention was finally back on Epstein after years of fatigue, decided to go first. They released a carefully chosen set of emails from Epstein's estate, including the ones where he says Trump spent hours at his house with a victim present and knew about the girls. It was a precision strike, a small number of highly combustible documents dropped into the center of the political map. Hours later, Republicans responded with a flood. The GOP-led Oversight Committee dumped an additional 20,000 pages of Epstein estate documents onto the public, bragging that they were delivering the full truth. In reality, it looked a lot like a classic Hill maneuver. If your opponent has just fired a single, well-aimed bullet, you throw up a cloud of paperwork and dare everyone to find it again. Let me walk you through how that plays out behind the scenes. Democratic staffers who just spent days combing through a finite set of emails for lines that would land suddenly find themselves buried under a mountain of PDFs, calendars, cash ledgers, call logs, obscure correspondence that might matter in 10 different ways or not at all. They don't have the manpower to sift it quickly, and they know most reporters don't either. Republican staffers are drafting talking points. Democrats cherry-picked emails to smear Trump. We're releasing everything. The White House jumps on that framing, accusing Democrats of weaponizing the pain of survivors for electoral gain. Democrats fire back that Republicans sat on those 20,000 pages for months and only released them the moment Trump started to take real damage from the first batch of emails. They accuse the GOP of muddying the waters, flooding the zone with noise to make it harder to focus on what Epstein said about the former president. Watching all this, I'm struck by how rarely we see Congress move this fast and this aggressively on anything involving transparency. Most of the time, these same members will lecture you about responsible redactions, about the need to protect sensitive methods and sources. But with Epstein, once the political utility became obvious, once Trump's name was plainly visible in those emails, the gears spun with unusual speed. And hovering over all of it is Trump himself, watching a branch of government he used to dominate suddenly operating on a track he doesn't fully control. The discharge petition, the bipartisan signatures, the oversight releases, they're all signals that, at least on this one issue, some Republicans are willing to cross him. Not because they turn into saints overnight, but because the cost of being seen as blocking the Epstein files has gotten too high. Here's what really scares me about this moment. It sets a precedent. If Congress can twist itself into knots, delay swearing-ins, play procedural games, weaponize obscure rules, all to manage the political fallout of one dead man's archive, what happens the next time a similarly explosive set of documents threatens someone else at the top of the food chain? Do we normalize the idea that transparency only comes when it's politically convenient for the majority? Or do we finally accept that some things, like whether the government protected, enabled, or soft-pedaled a predator with connections to presidents, have to be dragged into the light no matter whose poll numbers get scorched? As that petition crossed 218, as 20,000 more pages hit the oversight website, as staffers argued over redaction rules and floor schedules, one thing became painfully clear to me. The fight over the Epstein files is no longer just about what DOJ is hiding. It's about whether the political class will allow documented evidence to challenge the stories they've spent years telling about themselves and their leader. And nobody understands that better than Donald Trump. Which is why, almost as soon as these emails began to land, he started doing what he always does when the paper trail turns against him. He tried to rewrite the story, this time not just about his relationship with Epstein, but about the legitimacy of the files themselves. That counterattack is where we're headed next. Trump's counterattack from release the files to it's all faked. There's a moment in every scandal where you can tell the subject has finally realized this one might actually stick. With Trump and Epstein, that moment was written all over his reaction when the newest documents landed. You could feel the shift from swaggering calls for full transparency to the familiar panicked refrain. It's all rigged. It's all fake. They're all out to get me. Let me walk you through this evolution because it didn't start with denial. It started with a dare. For years, Trump and the media ecosystem around him used Epstein as proof of elite corruption. Epstein was the boogeyman you pointed at when you wanted to say, "See, they're all dirty except me." You'd hear it at rallies and interviews on friendly talk shows. Release the Epstein records. Release the lists. Let the people see what the so-called elites have been hiding. And on one level, that message played. People are rightfully furious that men like Epstein operated for so long with so much protection. Demanding release the files was politically cheap and emotionally satisfying. It cost him nothing because for years those files mainly threatened other people. Then the ground shifted. Suddenly, the paper trail was no longer an abstraction. It had dates, pages, subject lines. It had Trump's name in emails and logs. It had the words "knew about the girls" attached to a man he spent years minimizing his connection to. Even with every legal caveat attached, no charges, denials from accusers about any personal abuse, it was enough to crack the neat story he'd been telling. That's when the dare turned into something else. I remember watching one of his first reactions to the renewed focus on Epstein. The posture was classic Trump. "I've been saying for years, release everything. I want it all out. Nothing to hide." He wrapped himself in the language of transparency, as if he were the whistleblower, not a subject of the archives. But as more coverage focused on his own proximity, the parties, the quotes, the emails, the tone changed. The same files he treated as a weapon against the elites suddenly became suspect. Mentions of fake document started to creep into friendly interviews. Surrogates floated the idea that deep state actors had selectively leaked or even altered material to hurt him. The narrative shifted from "show the truth" to "you can't trust any of this." Let me paint you a picture of how that works behind closed doors. You're in a cramped room in a private club, not unlike the ones where Epstein once held court. A handful of lawyers, comms people, and political advisors are gathered around a TV showing the latest segment about the emails. Someone presses pause on a screenshot, Trump's name highlighted in a paragraph that's now being dissected on national television. On the whiteboard, there are 3 options written in thick marker. Ignore. Attack Epstein. Attack the documents. Ignoring is not in Trump's nature. Attacking Epstein is tempting, but risky. The more you talk about him, the more people go back and look at the pictures, the quotes, the logs. So they circle back to the move he's used in almost every major scandal of his life: undermine the evidence itself. The message template is simple. These are lies. These documents are being misrepresented. They're hiding the parts that clear me. You can't trust anything coming out of these agencies anymore. He doesn't have to prove forgery. He doesn't have to show that anything concrete is false. He just has to inject enough doubt that his supporters feel morally justified in treating the whole archive as radioactive propaganda. Here's what really scares me. This is not a one-off response to Epstein. It's part of a broader pattern, a playbook he's honed for years. We've seen versions of it with everything from election results to intelligence assessments. When a document helps him, it's ironclad. When it hurts him, it's suddenly heavily doctored, selectively leaked, taken out of context, or part of a witch hunt. The content doesn't change, the standard of trust does. Now imagine being inside one of the institutions on the receiving end of that. You're a career official at the Justice Department, or a line attorney who touched some sliver of the Epstein case years ago. You know how carefully these files are handled: chain of custody, authentication, court orders. Suddenly, a former president is hinting that the very records your office preserved are fake or manipulated. He doesn't just attack your conclusions. He attacks the existence of a trustworthy paper trail. In a healthy system, politicians argue about what documents mean. In a sick system, they argue about whether documents exist at all. Let me walk you through why that distinction matters. If we accept the idea that any official record that embarrasses a leader can be dismissed as fabricated, we've basically sawed off the branch we're sitting on. Court filings, investigative reports, congressional transcripts, all of it becomes optional reality, something you either believe or don't base solely on team loyalty. You can already see that logic trickling down. I've watched interviews where ordinary voters asked about the Epstein material shrug and say, "I don't know what's real anymore." They fake everything, not because they've examined the evidence and found flaws, but because they've absorbed the meta message. Paperwork is just another battlefield, and you pick your side before you pick your facts. Here's the other quiet shift that should worry all of us. When Trump was confident the files would hurt his enemies, he wanted maximum transparency. "Release everything," he'd say, and his crowds would roar. Transparency was framed as a weapon, a way to expose them. But the second those same structures of transparency threaten him, transparency itself becomes suspect. The same agencies he wanted to force into the light are now painted as conspirators. The same mechanisms, subpoenas, court orders, document dumps, suddenly become illegitimate when the arrow points in his direction. That's not just hypocrisy. It's a test balloon for something darker. The idea that the entire evidentiary infrastructure of a democracy should bend around one man's narrative. Now imagine a future crisis bigger than this one. Picture a major cyber attack or a murky intelligence report about an adversary's actions or a classified assessment about an internal threat. The president is presented with documents that cut against his preferred story. If his instinct is to say those files are fake whenever reality turns hostile, how does that play out when the subject isn't his reputation but national security? We've had presidents who lied. We've had presidents who covered things up. But we are now flirting with something more corrosive, a leader whose default move is to try to rip up the very concept of a common record when it stops serving him. The Epstein archive is a particularly volatile case because it mixes sex, power, and pain in a way that inflames every tribal instinct we have. It would be very easy to say, well, this is just one ugly corner of an otherwise functioning system. But I don't think that's true. The way Trump and his allies respond to these files, the leap from release everything to believe nothing, is a window into how they see all accountability mechanisms. Courts, committees, archives, inspectors general, useful when they wound your enemies, illegitimate when they even brush against you. And that brings us back to the question I keep circling. This isn't just a story about what Epstein did to Trump. It's a story about what Trump is willing to do to the idea of evidence itself in order to protect his own image. Because once you've trained millions of people to see every inconvenient document as a hoax, you haven't just shielded yourself from this scandal. You've built a world where nothing, not an email, not a transcript, not a sworn statement, can ever fully pierce the armor of belief again. And in that world, men like Epstein don't need to hide their secrets in locked safes. They just need to wait for us to stop believing in records at all. How the system protects men like Epstein and men like Trump. There's a line I hear a lot these days. If I did what he did, I'd be in jail. Most of the time, that's just anger talking. But when you look at Jeffrey Epstein's story, you realize it's not just anger. It's a diagnosis. The system really does bend in certain directions. Not always in backroom conspiracies. Often in something more banal, more corrosive, caution, deference, and an almost religious respect for people with the right title or the right bank balance. Let me walk you through this by starting with a case we already think we understand, Epstein's sweetheart deal in Florida. Back in 2008, Epstein didn't face a federal sex trafficking trial. He cut a deal. He pleaded guilty to 2 minor state charges, solicitation and procurement of a minor, while a federal non-prosecution agreement quietly promised that the U.S. government would not bring broader federal charges against him or certain unnamed potential co-conspirators. He served about 13 months in a county facility, much of it on work release, leaving jail for up to 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. He registered as a sex offender and went home to his mansions. Here's the part that still makes my blood run cold. The victims weren't told. A federal court later ruled that prosecutors violated the Crime Victims' Rights Act by negotiating that non-prosecution agreement in secret and keeping the young women in the dark while they cut a deal with his lawyers. Let me paint you a picture. Imagine you're 17. You finally found the courage to tell police what this man did to you. You sit in a windowless room, hands shaking, while an investigator asks questions you never wanted to answer. You're told there's an investigation, that justice will be done. Months pass. You hear nothing. Then one day you see a short article. He pled guilty to something. He's doing jail time. Case closed. Nobody called you. Nobody asked you to testify. Nobody even told you there'd been a deal. Years later, you find out that while you were trying to put yourself back together, teams of lawyers were in conference rooms, negotiating the exact language of an agreement that protected not just Epstein, but unnamed others. You learn that subpoenas for his hard drives were quietly canceled. You learn that he was allowed to pay into civil settlements while still controlling information through those payments. And then, much later, you learn that the Justice Department's own Office of Professional Responsibility looked at all this and concluded that, yes, the U.S. attorney in charge exercised poor judgment in that deal, especially by failing to properly notify victims and by keeping the terms so secret, but that no clear professional rules were technically broken. Bad judgment, not misconduct. In other words, regrettable, but acceptable. Here's what really scares me. That phrase, poor judgment, has become one of the most powerful shields in American public life. It's what you say when the facts are too ugly to defend, but the person at the center of them is too connected to completely sacrifice. I've watched that shield deployed up close. Different case, different names, same pattern. A powerful man, credible victims, a quietly negotiated resolution. Internally, everyone admitted the deal was highly unusual. Externally, the official review said it reflected discretion and, at worst, errors in judgment. The man retired with his pension. The victims got a paragraph in a report and a lifetime of what-ifs. That's the first way the system protects men like Epstein, not by declaring them innocent, but by declaring their enablers merely foolish instead of accountable. The second way is more subtle. Time. Look at the timeline. Local police in Palm Beach started working the case in 2005. They built a file thick enough to shock anyone who read it. The federal investigation stretched into 2007 and 2008. By the time the non-prosecution agreement was signed, years had already gone by. The longer a case drags on, the more leverage the defendant gets. Memories fade, witnesses move, prosecutors change jobs, political winds shift. By 2019, when the Miami Herald blew the story open and public outrage finally caught up, the original deal was a decade old. Epstein was arrested again on fresh charges in New York, yes, but only after he had spent years living a comfortably constrained life as a registered sex offender in one of the wealthiest zip codes in America. Delay is itself a form of protection. Third, opacity. The whole point of that non-prosecution agreement was to resolve globally Epstein's state and federal liability. The language, the secrecy, the fact that it shielded unnamed co-conspirators, all of that became ammunition later for Ghislaine Maxwell's lawyers, who tried to argue in court that the deal should protect her too. Courts ultimately rejected that argument, ruling that the agreement bound only federal prosecutors in one district, not the entire government, and certainly not future cases in New York. But the very fact that she could plausibly make that claim tells you something about how broad and sloppy that agreement was written. Think about what that means in practice. A prosecutor writes a generous, murky deal for a powerful defendant in 2008. Another powerful associate tries to use that foggy language as a shield more than a decade later. Victims are stuck in the middle, being told, again, that their day in court has to wait while lawyers argue over documents they never saw. Fourth, reputational deference. When former U.S. Attorney Alex Acosta was dragged back before Congress years later to explain himself, he didn't slink in as a disgraced outcast. He walked in as a former cabinet secretary and federal judge candidate, flanked by lawyers with a carefully constructed narrative. We did the best we could with a tough case. A trial would have been a crapshoot. We got some jail time and sex offender status when we might have gotten nothing. He acknowledged pain, expressed regret, but defended the logic of the deal. And he was talking to a committee full of people who understand, viscerally, how quickly their own careers can rise and fall on a single judgment call. Nobody in those rooms forgets that what happens to Acosta today could happen to them tomorrow. So the language stays cautious. The criticism stops short of declaring corruption. The system protects itself even as it nominally investigates itself. Now, you might be thinking, fine, that's Epstein. A prosecutor made a bad call. The DOJ half admitted it, and we're trying to fix it now. What does that have to do with Trump? More than you'd think. Because the same structural instincts that cushioned Epstein's fall, secrecy, deference, weaponized delay, are the ones that warp our response when a former president's name is all over that same archive. No, I'm not saying Trump and Epstein were protected in the exact same way. Their situations are different. Epstein was a rich predator facing sex crime charges. Trump is a former president facing a tangle of civil, criminal, and political investigations. But the architecture around them is built from the same beams. Let me paint you a picture of that architecture at the presidential level. You have internal Justice Department memos saying a sitting president can't be indicted. You have layers of privilege, executive privilege, attorney-client privilege, deliberative process privilege, that can be invoked to slow down any effort to get documents or testimony. You have political appointees sitting at the top of agencies that are supposed to be neutral, making calls on redactions and release schedules. And you have a Congress where half the members are terrified that setting a precedent of real accountability for one president might someday be used against their president. So when Trump's name surfaces in Epstein's emails, the system's first instinct is not, how do we give the public everything fast? It's, how do we manage this? We saw it in the years-long tug-of-war over Trump's own records, tax returns, January 6 documentation, internal White House communications. Every step required subpoenas, court fights, appeals. Deadlines slipped. Elections passed. By the time some of the material finally emerged, the urgency had faded for a lot of people, and the damage had already been baked in. Delay. Difference. Opacity. Again. Here's what really scares me. The people who complain loudest about a two-tier justice system are often the ones who benefit from its upper tier when the spotlight turns their way. Trump has been masterful at tapping into legitimate public anger about double standards, pointing at Epstein, at Wall Street, at corrupt politicians, and saying, look what they get away with. He's not wrong that there's a pattern. He just never finishes the sentence, and I am one of the men that pattern was built to protect. The truth is, the system has protected him in some of the same ways it protected Epstein, even as it also pursues him more aggressively than almost any former president in history. It protected him when DOJ policy made it nearly impossible to hold him criminally accountable while in office. It protected him when cautious prosecutors slow-walked hard decisions for fear of destabilizing the country. It protected him when judges hesitated to enforce subpoenas quickly because they didn't want to look political. And now, in the Epstein context, it protects him when agencies resist releasing the full archive, when redaction rules are stretched to the breaking point, when Congress has to resort to discharge petitions just to see what's already sitting in government servers. Most people will never read a single one of these documents. They will only read the story we tell about them. And because of that, the system's deepest instinct is to control the story. For Epstein, that control looked like a secret deal and a short sentence. For Trump, it looks like endless procedure and technical arguments about jurisdiction and privilege. Different shapes, same purpose. Keep the full, ugly picture from coming into sharp focus while the people at the top find ways to move on. Now imagine being one of the survivors watching this unfold. You see the man who hurt you get a lenient deal. You see the powerful friend who knew about the girls become president, and then fight like hell to discredit the very files that prove he knew. You see Congress using every trick in the book to avoid voting on whether to show the world what really happened. And you're told, once again, to trust the process. That's the heart of it for me. The Epstein saga and Trump's entanglement with it exposes not just individual sins, but an entire operating system, one that instinctively prioritizes stability over truth, status over pain, narrative over record. In the next chapter, we're going to look at what happens when that operating system collides with something even more volatile, a media and political culture obsessed with blackmail, compromat, and lists, a culture that takes this same broken infrastructure and turns it into a circus, even as real national security risks quietly grow in the background. Because once you understand how the system protects men like Epstein and Trump, you start to see the next question. If this is how carefully we shield them, what happens when the secrets finally slip through anyway? The media circus and the blackmail question. The night those new emails dropped, something strange happened. I had one screen open with raw PDFs and another screen open with what the country was actually seeing. On one side, timestamps, routing headers, dry language, little details that only make sense if you've spent years swimming in this stuff. On the other, thumbnails screaming Epstein client list exposed, anchors leaning into the camera like they're telling ghost stories at a campfire, and a flood of tweets insisting that somewhere out there is a single sheet of paper that explains everything. Let me paint you a picture. You're flipping through channels. On one network, there's a graphic with Epstein's mugshot on the left and Trump's face on the right, a jagged lightning bolt between them. The cheer-in says something like, new emails. What did Trump know? They play the same 50 words over and over, with new about the girls in bold. They bring on a legal analyst who has not had time to read the documents, but sure has time to speculate. Switch the channel. Different logo, different host, same circus. Now the story is that the deep state is weaponizing and proven allegations to smear Trump, and anyone who takes these emails seriously is a dupe. Epstein becomes a prop for a different narrative, not a predator, but a pawn in a never-ending war between patriots and the swamp. Meanwhile, on your phone, there's a clip from a podcast promising the real client list. Grainy graphics, ominous music, a whisper of Russian compromat and Mossad and secret islands, all blended into a story that's impossible to disprove because it never slows down long enough to make a concrete claim. Here's the problem. Almost none of this has anything to do with what's actually in the files. Let me walk you through the reality that lives underneath the thumbnails. There's no single client list carved on stone tablets and locked in a vault. What exists is a messy mosaic. Flight logs that show who flew with Epstein and when. Address books and contact lists with names, phone numbers, and little notes. Emails where powerful people check in, ask favors, or just bask in proximity. Testimony from victims and witnesses about who they saw in the townhouse on the island, in the cars. If you're looking for a clean roll call of everyone who did X, you're going to be disappointed. Investigators have said, publicly and repeatedly, that there is no magical master document listing clients in the way social media imagines it. What they have instead is a web of references that require context, cross-checking, and caution. But context doesn't go viral. Lists do. So the media does what it always does in a panic. It simplifies. On the left, Epstein becomes shorthand for Republican hypocrisy and Trump's dirty secrets. On the right, he becomes shorthand for Clinton world, Hollywood degenerates, globalist elites. Everybody has their villain of choice ready to go, and the same tortured names show up in every segment, like stock footage. Here's what really scares me. Caught between those two shouting matches is the part of this story that actually looks like intelligence work. Because when people hear the word blackmail, they picture a manila envelope dropped on a desk with photos and a note that says pay up. That's Hollywood. In the real world, blackmail is often much fuzzier. It's not a single folder. It's the knowledge that you could destroy someone if you strung together the right threads. In Russia, they have a word for it, compromising material. It doesn't have to be airtight. It just has to be believable enough in the right hands to scare the target. Let me paint you a different scene. You're an analyst in a foreign intelligence service. You're not a conspiracy theorist. You're a professional. You're handed the same public documents that you and I can access today, the logs, the emails, the court records. Your job is to ask one question. Which of these names represents leverage? You start a chart. Column 1. People credibly accused of participating in the abuse. That's the obvious category. If you have hard proof there, that's gold for blackmail. Column 2. People who were present repeatedly in Epstein's world, on flights, at properties, in emails, but who haven't been directly accused of hands-on abuse. They're in the gray zone. They could be innocent bystanders. They could have seen more than they admit. They could have done things that haven't surfaced yet. Either way, they're sensitive about the association. Column 3. People who, according to emails and testimony, knew about Epstein's behavior and tried to distance themselves later. They're not just in the photos, they're in the narrative. There's a before and an after in their public story. That's a vulnerability all by itself. Now you overlay something else, power. Who among these names controls policy, commands armies, signs trade deals, influences sanctions, shapes public opinion. Someone like Trump doesn't have to be on column 1 to be interesting to you. He might be squarely in column 2 or 3, socially close, publicly evasive, privately described as knowing about the girls, and that's enough to be worth flagging. At a minimum, you know that any new revelation, any unseen email, any stray witness could explode in his face. That gives you leverage, even if you never send a single threatening note. Here's the trick people miss about blackmail. The power often lies in the fear of what might be out there, not just what actually exists. Epstein didn't just collect girls. He collected proximity, photos, calls, favors, first-name relationships with people who ran banks, tech companies, media outlets, royal households, and, yes, political movements. He built an ecosystem in which a lot of very important people now have to answer a deeply uncomfortable question. How close were you really? And that's where the media circus helps the blackmail logic, even as it pretends to expose it. Because every time a headline screams client list, every time a talking head tosses out names without precision, every time a YouTuber promises the truth the elites fear, it reinforces a single dangerous idea, that there is some vast hidden ledger out there that could drop at any moment and wreck dozens of lives. If you're a foreign operative watching this, you don't have to have that ledger. You just have to convince a few key targets that you might. Now imagine a quiet conversation in a back channel somewhere. No threats, no envelopes, just a suggestion. We've seen some material that hasn't gone public yet. It could be awkward for certain people in your circle. We think we can help each other. Nothing written, nothing said outright. Just enough to make a person whose name appears in those logs, or whose friend's name appears next to younger women in a 20-year-old quote, wake up at 3 a.m. wondering what else could surface. And all this is happening while our domestic conversation is stuck on, is there a list? And which party is worse? Let me be clear, I'm not saying there is a secret blackmail archive sitting in some safe with Trump's name, highlighted in red. What I'm saying is that the perception of such an archive, stoked by sensationalist media, partisan attacks, and half-informed speculation, creates its own kind of leverage. It makes people more paranoid, more defensive, more willing to bend the truth or lash out preemptively to protect themselves. And while we're arguing over thumbnails, the human beings at the center of all this, the survivors, are living a different reality. Think about what it feels like to see your trauma turn into B-roll. To hear your story invoked as a punchline in monologues, a weapon in political debates, a hook in a podcast episode. You know that somewhere in those Epstein files are transcripts of your interviews, details of what happened to you in rooms you can't forget. But when those pages make it to television, your name is blacked out, your face is blurred, and your pain is just another piece of content in a 12-minute segment about whether a president knew. That's the other form of blackmail we don't talk about. Not one aimed at presidents or princes, but at survivors. Every new release forces them to relive what they've tried to bury. Every sensational headline tells them, your worst moments are still a currency other people trade in. Here's what really scares me. As long as we treat these files as entertainment, we are doing the work of every would-be blackmailer for free. We are teaching our culture to see secrets not as evidence to be weighed soberly, but as weapons to be brandished. And men like Trump live in the middle of that storm. For him, the Epstein archive is both a political hazard and a propaganda tool. He can point to it as proof of elite rot, even as he tries to distance himself from his own place in it. He can accuse his enemies of hiding their names, even as he suggests the parts that hurt him are fake. Either way, the underlying dynamic is the same. The files exist not as a path to truth, but as a reservoir of potential threat and potential power. Now imagine for a moment that this circus isn't over. Imagine there's another batch of documents somewhere in the pipeline, court records, internal memos, more emails, scheduled for release not in a quiet summer news cycle, but 2 weeks before a knife-edge election. Imagine how that would play out in this media environment, with this level of distrust, this love of lists and leaks and bombshells. That's not a far-fetched fantasy. That's a plausible scenario in the world we've built. And that's where we're headed next, into the thought experiment that's been keeping me up at night. Because once you see how easily the Epstein files can be turned into a circus and a weapon at the same time, you have to ask the question nobody in power wants to ask out loud. What happens when the next release hits us at the worst possible moment? Now imagine the next release. Let's do something most people in this town are terrified to do. Let's imagine the next release. Not abstractly, not as a talking point, as an actual day on the calendar, a real moment in your life. Now imagine it's late October in an election year. The polls are razor thin. Everyone is exhausted. You're trying to decide whether to vote early or wait until election day because your schedule is chaos and you don't fully trust anyone anymore. And then on a random Tuesday afternoon, your phone buzzes. Push alert, new Epstein files unsealed. Trump named in fresh documents. Let me paint you a picture of what that looks like from 3 different rooms at the exact same time. First room, your living room. You're making dinner. The TV is on in the background. One of the kids has homework spread across the coffee table. Suddenly, the anchor's voice changes. You know that tone, the "we have breaking news" voice that means something big just landed and no one really understands it yet. You see the mugshot. You see Trump's face. You hear phrases like newly released documents, previously sealed, victim statements, emails referencing the former president. The details are fuzzy, but the headline is sharp enough to cut through everything else. Epstein. Trump. New. You don't have an hour to sit and watch analysis. You get fragments. A lawyer here, a pundit there, a graphic showing the words "spent hours" and "knew about the girls" next to Trump's name. You're trying to stir the pot on the stove, answer a text from your boss, and explain to your teenager why this creepy-looking guy is on TV again talking about underage girls while a former president's face is right beside him. You weren't sure if you were going to vote. Now you're not sure what you even believe. Second room, a windowless war room in a campaign headquarters. I've been in that room. Fluorescent lights, stale coffee, people who've been living on adrenaline and bad takeout for 6 months straight. There's a giant digital clock counting down the days until the election. Every hour is already spoken for. Now someone bursts in holding a printout, a court order, a docket entry, a fresh PDF. The words Epstein, unsealed, and Trump appear in the same paragraph. Nobody has read past page 3, but that doesn't matter yet. Phones come out. Staff start scrolling. Someone yells at the comms team to get a statement drafted now. Lawyers are on speakerphone, half whispering, half shouting about context, authentication, the risk of defamation if they overreach. Opponents are already cutting ads in their heads. Allies are drafting tweets about political timing and witch hunts. In that room, this isn't a moral event. It's a tactical one. How many points in the suburbs? How much turnout bump or drop among younger voters, evangelical voters, independent women? Can we weaponize this without overplaying our hand? Can we dismiss this without looking like we're shrugging at victims again? The entire conversation is framed in numbers, not names. Third room, a federal courthouse. Here, everything moves slower, at least on the surface. A judge has just agreed to unseal another chunk of the Epstein archive after years of motions, appeals, and respectful disagreements between lawyers who absolutely despise each other. There's a clerk uploading PDFs to a public database, one eye on the progress bar, the other on the clock because it's almost closing time. Within minutes, those documents are no longer just lines of text on a server. They're screenshots in a million feeds. The judge knows this. The lawyers know this. The Justice Department knows this. And here's what really scares me. Just down the hall, there's probably a second hearing already underway. Emergency motion from somebody's lawyer, asking the court to slow this down, to redact more names, to avoid prejudicing ongoing matters, or prevent irreparable harm to someone who hasn't been charged. The language will sound sober, technical, responsible. The subtext is, if this comes out now, in this climate, it will explode. Now imagine what that explosion looks like when it hits all three rooms at once. In your living room, it lands as confusion and fatigue. Another scandal. Another story about elites and predators and blind eyes. You may not change your vote because of it, but it might change how you feel walking into that booth. More disgusted, more cynical, more convinced that everyone at the top is covered in the same mud. In the campaign war room, it lands as opportunity or threat. One side will decide to go nuclear with it. The other will scream fake even louder than before. Every cable hit, every rally, every email blast becomes another rehearsal of the same question. What did he know? The survivor's pain becomes B-roll in attack ads. In the courthouse, it lands as a stress test. Judges have to decide in real time whether to keep releasing documents that could reshape an election or to slow things down in the name of fairness and stability. And every choice has a political consequence, no matter how neutral the language in the ruling looks. Let me walk you through the part of this that haunts me the most, the kids. Not the kids in the documents, the kids watching all of this. A 14-year-old scrolling TikTok is going to see this story in the least contextualized way imaginable. A clip of Trump laughing with Epstein at a party. A screenshot of New About the Girls with a dramatic filter. Maybe a conspiratorial video claiming this proves every wild theory they've ever heard about secret islands and hidden tapes. They won't see the footnotes, the legal standards, the survivor's statement saying he never touched me. They'll see the mashup, presidents and predators and billionaires in the same unsorted pile. And they'll draw a conclusion that's hard to unteach. These people are all the same. Here's what really scares me. That conclusion is emotionally satisfying and dangerously incomplete. Because if everyone is equally corrupt, equally complicit, equally beyond redemption, then no choice you make in that voting booth matters. No institution is worth saving. No document, no testimony, no archive can ever convince you that one leader is meaningfully different from another. That's the real risk of the next release landing at the wrong moment. Not just that it hurts Trump or helps him by triggering backlash, but that it deepens the one wound our democracy might not survive. The belief that truth itself is just another weapon. Now imagine how foreign adversaries watch that play out. You think they're not building models right now? You think they're not studying how each batch of Epstein files moves polls, shifts social media sentiment, fractures coalitions? You think they're not gaming out the perfect time to amplify certain narratives, to push certain clips harder, to quietly feed certain interpretations into the bloodstream? They don't have to forge documents to do damage. They just have to ride the wave of our own releases, our own leaks, our own failures to handle painful truth in a grown-up way. And all the while, the survivors are trapped in a recurring nightmare. Every new batch of files is another round of forced remembrance. Another news cycle where people dissect the worst moments of their lives while arguing about whether a man who never laid a hand on them, but knew about the girls, deserves another shot at power. They watch their trauma get dropped into the middle of a presidential election like a grenade, and they're told again that this is bigger than them. Let me be brutally honest here. We have built zero safeguards for this kind of collision. We have no serious rules about how close to an election major document releases should happen. We have no independent body that can say, this material is explosive and necessary. Here's how we stage it so the public can absorb it without turning it into pure partisan ammunition. We just drop PDFs onto the internet and hope that a screaming match somehow adds up to accountability. Hope is not a process. So when I imagine the next release, I don't just see Trump's name in bold again. I see judges being dragged into the culture war, prosecutors being accused of rigging elections whether they move fast or slow, journalists trying to summarize thousands of pages in a 3-minute segment, and a public so burnt out they start to treat every new revelation as white noise. And yet, I still believe the next release has to come. All of it has to come. Because the alternative, locking these files away forever in the name of stability, is just another way of saying that the worst secrets will always be revealed on someone else's schedule when they can do the most damage. That's exactly how we ended up here. Years of secrecy, followed by sudden, catastrophic bursts of truth at the worst possible times. Here's the question that keeps me up. When the next Epstein documents surface, and they will we finally be able to see them not just as a weapon against one man, but as a mirror for the kind of leaders we tolerate? Because at some point, this stops being a story about timing and tactics and becomes something simpler. What does this archive, in all its ugliness, actually tell us about who Donald Trump is, what he values, and how much we're willing to overlook in a man who asks for our trust? That's where we need to go next. What this actually says about Trump. At some point, you have to stop asking, what did the document say? And start asking, what does this say about him? Because if all of this, the quotes, the photos, the emails, the congressional games, the screaming on TV, doesn't tell us something deeper about Donald Trump's character, then what's the point of digging through any of it? Let me walk you through how this looks when I step back from the noise and just draw the outline of the man I see in these pages. We've already covered the raw facts. Trump and Epstein's world, not just once but over years, parties, planes, clubs. Trump calling Epstein a terrific guy who liked younger women before it was inconvenient to remember that. Trump later insisting he barely knew him, that there was a falling out, that he banned him. Epstein in private emails putting Trump in a room for hours with a victim and saying of course he knew about the girls, while also saying he didn't personally participate in the abuse. Trump now trying to undermine the very files he once demanded be released. Strip away the names and imagine you're looking at this as a case file on an unknown leader in another country. What would you say? You'd say, here is a man who gravitates toward people who live on the edge of legality, praises them when they're useful, disowns them when they're radioactive, and then attacks the credibility of any record that shows how close they really were. You'd say, here is a leader for whom proximity to danger is not a bug, it's a feature. Let me paint you a picture from a different chapter of my career. Years ago, I sat with a senior official, not from this country, whose government was in the middle of a corruption scandal. One of his top allies had been caught taking bribes. There were bank records, secret recordings, the whole thing. The official's defense was almost a parody. He barely knew the man. He was one of many advisors. He had no idea what was going on. Then, a week later, photos surfaced of them vacationing together with their families. Another week, and a leaked email showed the official thanking him privately for taking care of a sensitive matter. When I asked someone who'd worked with him for years, off the record, what this revealed, they said something that stuck with me. He doesn't see people as dirty or clean. He sees them as useful or not. If you're useful, your sins are just part of the package. If you stop being useful, suddenly he remembers he's a man of principle. That sentence has been echoing in my head every time I look at Trump's story with Epstein. Because this isn't just about whether he knew about the girls. It's about the fact that knowing didn't seem to bother him enough to walk away until it threatened him personally. It's about the fact that his first instinct was to boast about Epstein's taste in women, not to question it. It's about how easily he slid from terrific guy to barely knew him the second the social math changed. Here's what really scares me. That pattern doesn't stay confined to one awful friend. It shows up everywhere. You see it with the people he's put around him, the advisors who end up indicted, the lawyers who lose their licenses, the aides who become coffee boys the moment they're arrested. You see it in the way he talks about violent extremists at rallies, first as very fine people or patriots, Then if the blowback gets too hot, as troublemakers he never really endorsed. You see it in his relationship to the truth, enthusiastic when it flatters him, disposable when it doesn't. The Epstein emails don't create that pattern. They confirm it. They're one more tile in a mosaic that's been forming for years. Let me put this in the blunt terms national security people use when the cameras are off. When you evaluate a leader's risk profile, you're not just asking, did he commit a crime? You're asking, who does he choose to surround himself with? How does he respond when those people are exposed? How does he talk about evidence that implicates him, even indirectly? Is there a gap between his private knowledge and his public story? And how wide is it? In Trump's case, you have a man who chose to orbit someone like Epstein, who publicly celebrated him, who almost certainly heard enough whispers to know this wasn't normal Playboy behavior, and who still didn't sever ties until it became politically dangerous not to. You have a man who, once elected, demanded transparency about Epstein when he thought it would hurt other people, then screamed hoax the second the documents splashed onto him. You have a man who has trained millions of his followers to treat any record that embarrasses him as automatically suspect, from court filings to committee transcripts to, now, the words of a dead man he once called a terrific guy. What does that say about him? It says this is someone for whom truth is negotiable, loyalty is one way, and proximity to predators is acceptable as long as it remains profitable. It says this is someone who sees institutions, courts, Congress, the press, even the archives themselves, not as guardrails but as obstacles or tools, depending on the day. And when that someone wants to sit at the center of a constitutional system again, with power over prosecutions, over intelligence, over who gets investigated and who gets left alone, you have to ask a hard question. Can you trust a man like that with a machinery designed to hold men like that accountable? Now imagine a future situation that has nothing to do with Epstein. Imagine a crisis involving a foreign ally accused of abusing children in refugee camps. Evidence starts to surface, reports, photos, whistleblower testimony. A President Trump is presented with a file that says, in effect, he knew about the girls. But this time the he is a general, a prince, a business partner. The alliance is useful. The deals are lucrative. The photo ops are good for the base. What do you honestly think his instinct will be? To cut ties or to attack the evidence? To stand with the victims or with a man who flatters him? We don't get to answer that question in the heat of the crisis. We answer it now in how we interpret stories like this one. This is why I keep saying this isn't just another scandal. This is a stress test of our tolerance. How much proximity to darkness are we willing to write off as just how the world works when it comes wrapped in a familiar slogan and a promise to hurt our enemies? How much rewriting of history are we willing to swallow because the alternative would mean admitting we were wrong about who we put our faith in? Most people will never read the Epstein files. They will never see the actual pages where Epstein talks about Trump, or the logs that put them in the same places, or the careful language prosecutors use to describe what they can and can't prove. What they will see is the story Trump tells about it, and how much his party, his movement, and his voters are willing to let him get away with. And that, more than any email or flight log, is what this saga really says about him. Not just that he knew a man like Epstein, but that even now, with the truth leaking through every crack in the wall, he still assumes he can bend reality hard enough that knowing won't matter. In the final chapter, I want to step away from him for a moment and talk about the people whose lives were shattered. And long before any of us saw a single document, and the choice this country faces about whose pain counts, whose secrets matter, and what we're willing to look at in the mirror when the names on the page are people we once cheered for. The victims, the memory, and the choice we face. Let me start where this should have started all along. Not with Trump. Not with Congress. Not with me. With the people whose lives were already in pieces long before anybody in Washington started arguing about redactions and discharge petitions. When you read enough of these files, you start to recognize the rhythm of a victim's statement. The stilted phrasing. The pauses where the stenographer just writes silence because the person can't go on for a minute. The way certain details are weirdly specific. A smell, a carpet pattern, the color of a door, because trauma burns in the small things, not the big ones. Most of those names are blacked out now. For privacy. For safety. Sometimes because that's what they asked for. So you see lines like, redacted, stated she met Mr. Epstein when she was redacted years old. And in the same document, you'll see a billionaire's name, clean and unredacted, because protecting his privacy was never part of the deal. Let me paint you a picture. You're one of those survivors. You've spent years trying to build a life around a wound that never really closes. Maybe you've changed jobs, changed cities, changed your name. You've sat in courtrooms where lawyers call you alleged like they're ordering a coffee. You've told your story to detectives, to reporters, to therapists, to a judge who seemed half asleep. At some point, the phone stops ringing. The case is resolved. Epstein is dead. Maxwell is sentenced. The world moves on. You tried. Then one day you're in a grocery store checkout line and you see his face on the news again. Not because of a new charge, not because anyone suddenly cares about what happened to you, but because a new batch of documents might hurt or help a former president. Your trauma has become a political variable. Here's what really haunts me. In this fight over what Epstein did to Trump, we keep using the victims as scenery. We mention them as context, as emotional leverage, as proof that this is serious, and then we pivot right back to the horse race. Did this hurt him? Did this help him? What does this do to the pulse? I've been guilty of that too. I've sat in meetings where we talked about which story to run, which angle to take, which quote to lead with. And somewhere in the back of my mind, I knew that every time we splashed the girls across a headline, some of those women would see it, would feel their bodies tighten, would have to decide whether to click or look away. In the files, their words carry the whole weight of this case. Without them, there is no archive, no flight logs that matter, no emails that make sense, no paper trail at all. It's their memory that turned Epstein from a rumor into a convict. And yet, in public, they are mostly reduced to silhouettes, blurred faces in documentaries, pseudonyms in lawsuits, quiet voices on late-night cable when the other guests have gone home. Let me walk you through what this looks like from their side of the glass. You testify. You sit in deposition rooms for hours. You answer questions about what you wore, what you drank, what you said, what you didn't say. You're asked if you smiled, if you went back, if you ever told anyone no. The implication sits there on the table. Maybe you were complicit. Maybe you liked it. Maybe you're exaggerating now. But you push through. Because someone told you this is how you get justice. Years later, you find out those transcripts are part of the Epstein files. Everyone is now demanding be released. The same statements that cost you sleep and relationships and sanity are being treated as content, something to be dumped, mined, weaponized. When people say we need the full truth, they're talking about your body, your memories, your shame. Now imagine hearing that the release of those documents is being scheduled, delayed, accelerated, fought over, based on what's best for one man's political prospects. That's the part of this story I can't shake. Because when we talk about what Epstein did to Trump from beyond the grave, we risk flipping the whole moral map upside down. The real damage was never to him. It was to them. The girls who were never really girls, but who were treated as disposable. The young women who thought they were being offered a job, a chance, a way out, and instead got pulled into something that will sit in their nervous systems for the rest of their lives. Trump is not the main character of this archive. He's just the most famous name in the margins. And yet, the way we respond to his part in the story will tell every future victim something important about what their suffering is worth to us. If we decide to shrug and say, well, he didn't personally commit the abuse, so who cares what he knew? We're sending a message. Proximity doesn't matter. Judgment doesn't matter. If you're powerful enough, you can orbit the worst people in the world and still be treated as clean as long as you didn't get caught in the act. If, on the other hand, we treat this as a character test, not of criminal guilt, but of moral fitness, we send a different message. That knowledge carries weight. That choosing to stay close to a predator says something about you. That I knew, but I didn't participate is not the exoneration some people seem to think it is. Here's what really scares me. This isn't just about Trump. It's about what we're teaching the next generation about accountability. Imagine a young woman watching all of this unfold. She hears the stories. She reads the documents. She watches a man who knew about the girls run for power again. What is she supposed to conclude? That if someone hurts her, the system will protect her? Or that if the man who looked the other way is charismatic enough, valuable enough, entertaining enough, we'll find a way to live with it? Imagine a young man watching. He sees that proximity to corruption, to cruelty, to casual exploitation doesn't disqualify you from leadership. It just becomes another controversy to spin. What is he learning about what it means to be a man in power? Let me say something that might sound strange, coming from someone who swims in documents for a living. The files aren't the point. They are necessary. They are precious. They are hard-won proof in a world that constantly gaslights victims and protects the powerful. But they are not sacred objects. They are tools, mirrors, warnings. What matters is what we do after we read them. Do we treat them as gossip fuel, something to share, argue over, then forget? Do we reduce them to a weapon to be aimed at whichever politician we already hated? Do we shrug and say, that's just how the elite world works, and move on? Or do we let them change how we draw the line between acceptable and unacceptable in the people we trust with power? Do we build systems where non-disclosure agreements can't be used to bury patterns of abuse? Do we strengthen victim notification laws so no one ever wakes up to discover a sweetheart deal in the newspaper again? Do we demand that candidates be honest about their past associations, not just when the photos are flattering, but when the pictures make your stomach turn? That is the choice in front of us. Not whether Donald Trump goes to prison over Epstein. Legally, that was probably never on the table. The choice is whether we let someone who lived comfortably in that orbit, who shrugged at that darkness, and now attacks the legitimacy of the record itself, step back into a position where he can shape which secrets stay buried and which see daylight. Most people will never read a single page of the Epstein archive. They will rely on people like me to tell them what it means. That's a responsibility that keeps me up at night. Because at the end of the day, this isn't a story about a dead predator and a former president. It's a story about us, about what we're willing to accept, about whose pain counts, about whether documents like these become the foundation of accountability or just another layer of noise we stack on top of the truth until it suffocates. We don't get to choose what's in the files. We do get to choose what kind of country reads them. And in the end, it's not the files that decide who we are. It's what we do after reading them. This is an imagined political thriller story, not a real classified leak or inside intelligence.